Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm looking at mega projects. That's a term that refers to huge projects such as the construction of an airport terminal, digging a railway tunnel, or maybe the merger of two companies. You don't have to look too far in the news to see stories of where a mega project has had a cost or timing overrun. Berlin's BER airport that opened 9 years later than planned with costs of more than 4 times the original estimate is a really good example. And chances are, wherever you're listening to this, there'll be a mega project somewhere nearby that's gone wrong on some level. Why that happens and what we can do to prevent it is the subject of this episode. I'm fascinated by this because, as you'll hear, what applies to mega projects also applies to things that we take on as individuals, whether that's building a house extension, planning a wedding, or maybe a round-the-world motorbike trip. Anything that by normal standards is abnormally large can pose problems. My guest is Professor Bent Flyvbjerg, who holds 2 titles. He's the first BT Professor and Chair on Major Programme Management at Oxford University and the Villum Kann Rasmussen Chair and Professor in Major Programme Management at the IT University of Copenhagen. His specialism is in mega projects and why they go wrong, and he's the co-author of a book called How Big Things Get Done, in which he explores why mega projects can often face overruns and what we can do to avoid that from happening. His book ends by pointing out that the biggest risk to projects is, drumroll please, human. It's our inability to plan properly and learn lessons from other project failures that's at the root of most problems. So this couldn't be a more human risk-related book or subject. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Professor Bent Flyvbjerg on how big things get done. Bent, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here, and we're going to come on and talk about How Big Things Get Done, which is your fabulous book. But before we do that, how does one get interested in mega projects and big things?
So my background is in economic geography. And at one stage, I noticed, this was when I was a professor at Aalborg University in Denmark, and I noticed that more things got done as big projects. So there was like a step change, in Denmark. All of a sudden, they built the world's longest suspension bridge when it was completed, the second longest underwater rail tunnel in all of Europe. And the project was like 17 times bigger than the biggest project built in Denmark in history until that time, So I was just wondering, is this something that is this a general trend or not? And I started studying it and found that it is a general trend. So basically, I just observed my surroundings, like a researcher does. And I saw that this is a trend that is happening. More and more big projects are being built. And then I wanted to get information on these projects, and I couldn't. There was no information, no systematic information. That's the perfect situation for a scholar. You want to find a wide area on the map, like the geographers in the olden days. And then you go out and chart that area and find out what's happening here and try to explain it and try to suggest how can you improve what's happening here. So that's the background.
Fascinating. We'll come on to look at some of those mega projects, I'm sure, as we talk about things. But I can't let the book title go, How Big Things Get Done. And I love the fact that you've used the word things in there, partly because my definition of human risk includes the word things, deliberately to encompass a broad range of things. But what I liked about it is the book that you've written, when you use the word things, of course, you're talking about big tunnels, big things in the world, but you're also talking about literally things like people redesigning their kitchens. So the term things I thought was a fascinating choice because it really does encompass this full range. It's a broad church of stuff that is just big.
Yeah. And we have a whole chapter on kitchen renovation, a great case study. Actually, this was our editor when we first first pitched the book to the publisher Penguin Random House. The editor said, "This reminds me of the situation I'm in right now. We are renovating our kitchen." And then I said, "Hey, we're going to pick your brain about this and see if there's a story there that we can include in the book." So that's the background for that. We also include weddings, and writing a book, putting on a conference, doing a film, like you said, big architecture, huge energy projects, huge transportation projects, tunnels, bridges, mining, and so on. Formally, we're actually studying 25. We have data on 25 different project types. But this basically applies to anything that you can think of that you want to do in life or that you want to build in life.
And so the key point being here, that these are all big undertakings from the perspective of the people doing them. So it's not things that people have done before. It's new, big undertakings. And you finish the book with the point where I want to start, which is you say the final sentence of it, and I love this, is your biggest risk is you. And so what we're looking at here, this is not a book about, I mean, it covers these things, but it's not a book that talks about building techniques or design technique. This is looking at the human biases that make us likely to make mistakes when we're taking on something possibly bigger than we've ever taken on before or at a very large scale.
Yeah. And like you said, big from our perspective. So like writing a book is a big thing for me, so that's a big project for me. But if you look at putting a subway into New York City and Manhattan, that's a completely different type of big projects. But they are both big projects in our terminology for this book. And the thing you start with, my heuristic, as I call it, so that's a leadership principle. Your biggest risk is you. I think it's the perfect way, it's the place to start. It's actually the most important message of the book and of all of my work. And it's the most overlooked message that I find, that this is a blind spot in our area. And people think of risk as something external, it's just things coming from the outside, when you talk about the markets and you talk about the price of steel, the price of labor, whatever, if you start digging a tunnel, you talk about the geology, what are we going to find when we go underground? It's always a big uncertainty. If you're talking about construction, what's the weather going to be like? So all these external factors, that could hit you and your project. That's how risk is normally conceptualized. And it's completely wrong. I mean, our research very, very clearly documents that the biggest risk is you. So the biggest risk is the human factor. It's actually, and we're not denying that all these objective risks are out there. So geology does exist, weather does exist, etc. The markets do exist. The steel price is real. So is inflation, and so on and so forth. But it actually turns out, when we study this in detail and crunch the numbers, that the biggest contribution to overall risk is our misconception of risk. So we misunderstand risk, and that's where your biggest risk is because you have all these objective risks and all these objective data about those risks, and we, to a very, very wide extent, if we're not very careful, and even when we are careful to some extent, we misjudge these risks. And of course, this is what behavioral science is about, all the cognitive biases that we have.
So there's a fascinating tension between humans' desire to build the biggest, and we can see this, whenever people launch things, there's an aim to get to the top of the league table, biggest, fastest, greatest, to break new records, and we see that at the Guinness Book of Records. So we have this propensity to want to take on big things, and even us as individuals, we're willing to take on big projects, which I guess is part of the reason the species is still here, in that we've striven for new things and that desire to sort of overcome challenges. And yeah, as you point out in the book, we're not necessarily well equipped to do that.
We are indeed very poorly equipped to do that. It is true that we have this ambition, and it's probably something, like you indicate, something that is hardwired into us, and we need it for our survival. Also, politicians need it for their survival. It's great to get you in the news, if you're out cutting the ribbon on the world's longest suspension bridge, that gets your attention from all over the world, and including your voters, right? There's nothing politicians like or need more than that, the attention from voters. And engineers, if you're an engineer, what would you rather work on? Some project that is the biggest of its kind, or the tallest of its kind, or the fastest of its kind, or the deepest of its kind? It's very clear. Engineers have, a passion for doing things that sort of push the envelope. This is only, people in general, but also the specific groups that are actually deciding about big projects, and the specific groups that are designing the projects. They are driving things in that direction, big. And we can see that again. The data very clearly show that the average size of projects and the biggest projects get bigger and bigger over time. We don't only get more and more projects, we also get bigger and bigger projects. So it's a very clear trend And like you indicate, we're not good at this. Actually, our brains is almost embarrassing, when we study how our brains work and compare it to what is needed to make these projects succeed. So we have this enormously simple linear kind of thinking. We just love geometry, like give me a triangle and a circle and I'm happy, right? And this is not at all how big projects work. Big projects are complex, they are very non-linear, and they have what we call, so non-linearity, which means acceleration. So anything you do in a big project, the impacts of it accelerate through the project and into the impacts on the surroundings and so on. So it's the opposite of linear. In mathematics and statistics, you distinguish between things that are linear and things that are non-linear, and it's an incredibly important distinction. Unfortunately, our brains are best suited for what is linear. That doesn't have extreme acceleration, extreme amplification, and therefore extreme risks. So that's where risks are generated, right, through amplification. And given the fact that the big projects have lots of nonlinearity and lots of amplification, our brains are not good at dealing with the risk. It takes special effort, special understanding, special tools, special theories, to grasp what's going on first, and then to actually develop the measures and the leadership principles that makes it possible for you to deal with the problems that you get when you are doing big
things. Right. It struck me that one of the things that's interesting is about humans is that we use past experience to guide us on some level, the what doesn't kill you makes you stronger logic. And so we build heuristics based around past behavior. And yet what I thought was really interesting was you highlight in the book this unwillingness to compare what we're doing to other things. And so we might be doing a project which we will conclude is very unique, very different, and very special. And yet, as you rightly highlight, actually, there are often things that we could learn from other people's mistakes and learn from the experiences of other people. And we choose not to do that because we characterize, typically in these bigger projects, they're characterized as very unique, very never been done before. And therefore, there isn't something I could learn. And I'm fascinated by that. On the one hand, we do have a natural propensity to learn from past experience. On the other hand, you point very rightly to the fact that people want their projects unique, and we're not learning when it comes to some of these larger projects.
Yeah. So this is something I call uniqueness bias. And this is something I've had the opportunity to test with lots of project planners and managers, and indeed the people who are making the decisions about these projects. So a lot of the training I do is executive training, where I get people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who are already in pretty high mid-career positions. And they're the ones who are doing the stuff that we're talking about now, both in government and in business. And I often ask them, so how many of you think your project is unique, and a host of hands go up, People really think that their projects are unique. Then the next thing I say that, hey, anybody who is on a project team and they think their project is unique, you should actually get rid of them. Get them off the team or send them to my classes to get re-educated, because this is solid research that we study. What is the relationship between team members thinking their product is unique and their project performance? And the more team members think their project is unique, the lower their performance is. So the bigger the cost overruns they will have, the bigger the schedule overruns they will have, the bigger the benefit shortfalls they will have. And this is something that comes out in the data. So it's an objective fact that if you think your project is unique, you underperform. And we don't think that's difficult to understand, because if you think your product is unique, you don't have anything to learn from other people's projects because you're unique, right? How could you learn something from others' projects? So that means that this huge accumulation of experience from other projects is ignored in the project that you're doing. And that just is plain dumb. That's all I can say. And it happens all the time. So like some people sometimes say to me, they say, well, this is commonsensical. And I'm saying, yeah, but there's not a lot of common sense in the way projects are being done.
It's that classic thing about common sense. The trouble with common sense is it's not that common.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought was interesting as I was reading it. And, I've not been involved in some of the mega projects you've talked about, but as I was sort of reflecting back to corporate projects I've been involved in, I was almost having PTSD in some respects, because the things that you talk about for, big airport terminals and bridges and those sort of big architectural things, actually, it's exactly the same dynamics. And so one of the things I thought was great about the book is this, yes, this is about those mega things, but this is also about things the majority of people will have experienced in some way, shape, or form. And particularly if you've worked in a corporate on a project, you will recognize some of these dynamics. And so it makes me smile when you say that, because we can all step back and independently go, well, that's a bit stupid. But actually, when we're in the heat of the moment, these heuristics that we all use kick in, and it's imposing friendly fire on the project in many cases.
Yeah. And you're right. This is a general point, and this is we try to emphasize this in the book. That this is not about only big projects. The mega projects, so multi-billion pound or dollar or euro projects. This is also about the smaller projects that we do in our daily lives. And in the beginning, we actually thought that they were going. So this is like in the beginning when I did this research, started doing this research, we thought that there would be big differences between big and small projects. And it turns out that there actually isn't. When we got the data, after years and years of study, we had enough data that we could start comparing bigger and smaller and medium projects. And it turns out that there are some differences, but mainly commonalities are much more pervasive than differences. And we started speculating about why this is so. And we try to explain in the book that, again, this is not so hard to understand because it's humans doing things no matter what it is. Like whether it's small or big, it's still human beings doing it. So whatever biases, cognitive biases, and what we call political or power biases we bring to the effort are going to be there, whether it's big or small. So those biases are going to impact the outcomes. That's exactly what we see. So basically, the explanation is that our biases are the same whether we are doing big or small, and therefore our outcomes become biased in the way they do with cost overruns, benefit shortfalls, and so on.
It reminded me of this sort of belief that we implicitly have with a lot of systems and processes that somehow humans in a work environment where there's structure and order and committees and processes will somehow behave differently to humans in their personal lives. I'm not saying we bring our entire lives to the workplace, but the cognitive raw material that walks into an office or logs onto a system is the same one we have. And the bit I thought was interesting was that if we looked at the effort that organizations and projects go to build governance around them, so committees and processes and budgets and justification, auditing, all that sort of stuff, you end up with the similar challenges in, as you say, the wedding planning or the kitchen design or something in the domestic sphere. It's exactly those same things coming there. And so in many respects, I was reflecting on it thinking a lot of these processes that we have, they're logical solutions to the problem, right? We wouldn't want to let someone loose on a project with billions without having some governance around it. But actually, we've got to be thinking about that governance in the context of the way human brains work. And often it seems to me that many of the processes that we have in the workplace that purport to deliver good governance and good judgment don't necessarily get there for the reasons that you outline.
Exactly. And if we talk about mega projects proper, so the real multi-billion dollar animals, then you'd be surprised to see how often there's very little governance, or the governance is not the right type of governance. It's inadequate one way or the other. That's actually more common than not. It's improving, I have to say, but still. So that's one point. Second point, even if you're successful with the governance and you get appropriate governance, you get more and more of this, you are actually making the project more and more complex. And we just discussed, how our brain is not suited to deal with complexity. So we are building in complexity on a thing, and we think the complexity is going to solve our problems. Instead, it increases our problems. So we have to be extremely careful. And one of the things that our research shows is that simplicity is the solution. So if you can't simplify this, if you just keep piling on more and more complex governance structures, you're not going to solve the problem. You need to figure out what is a simple governance structure that will actually work, and where you preferably have documentation that you can document that it actually worked in real life before you start using it. So it's not some theory you have that you're now going to test on your project. It's the tested and tried way of doing things, and we know from whatever other projects that it works. Now we're going to do it on our project. So that is experience-based. That's why we have a chapter, which I really like because it's a riff on an old Jimi Hendrix album. It's actually the title of an old Jimi Hendrix album, Are You Experienced? That's the title of one of the chapters. And it's all about this.
You talk about sort of breaking things down, keeping it simple, and you're Danish. And I love the fact that you managed to get Lego in there, and not just gratuitously, but actually that's a genuine. I mean, you talk literally about it. Can you just explain to listeners how that works? Because I loved it because it was a good excuse for me to continue to play with Lego and build models and things because I could pretend I'm doing something sophisticated. But I loved the one. It works really well as an analogy because we all understand it. But I think secondly, the building brick thing. It's not just beautiful because you're Danish. It actually works really well as a neat analogy.
Well, that's because it works in reality and not just as an analogy. Yeah, I'm Danish, and I grew up with Lego, like everybody else in Denmark and now the world. And one of the leadership principles in the book, one of 11 leadership principles, is that we encourage leaders to ask themselves, "What's your Lego?" So that's a question for anybody who's a leader. Like, start asking, "What's your Lego of yourself and your organization, of your team?" And I further postulate that if you don't know what your Lego is, that's your problem. That's what you should be working on, because it means you don't have a basic building block. That's really what a Lego is, right? It's a basic building block. And we're not saying that there's just one Lego, like even in real Lego, there are many building blocks. Too many, Lego concluded at one stage and started cleaning their act up, and reducing the number of different Legos. So you need a number of Legos building blocks in what you're doing if you're going to be successful with your projects. And the beauty of Legos is they're standardized. So once you have a standard building block, you can keep doing that and you can keep using that. And because you're doing the same thing over and over, you'll get better and better at it. That's the key to learning. And that's why Legos work, is that because there are basic building blocks, they keep repeating, they replicate. And every time you replicate something, you get better at it. And when you get better at it, that means you can do it faster, you can do it cheaper with better results and so on. That's exactly what you want when you're doing projects. And in the book, we explain how this is actually the explanation of why, for instance, wind power and solar power are incredibly successful, and why the price has come down faster than even the green organizations ever hoped. That green energy is becoming more abundant and more cheap than anybody had hoped, which is just our luck, and it's because they are completely modular. So they're built on Legos. And at the other end of the scale, you have nuclear power and big hydroelectric dams, which are bespoke. They are not based on Legos, and they have dismal performance. So it's the opposite end of the scale regarding the size of cost overruns and delays and underperformance in general. And it's because they have no Legos. They're bespoke. Each nuclear power plant is a one-off project, more or less. Because the safety standards are very high and they keep going up and being changed and so on. So this is a general principle. The more you can standardize something as Legos, you can start building them in factories instead of on sites. This is another thing, one of the things we mentioned in the book. You need to get rid of the construction site. So if we're talking about construction, you actually don't want construction sites. You want assembly sites. And only once you get the construction site changed into an assembly site will construction move into the 20th century, not even the 21st century, but the 20th century, meaning that they're using manufacturing and so on, which is a controlled environment where you can be much more efficient and you can drive your efficiencies. And then you just bring the Legos on site and you assemble them on site on the assembly site, not the construction site. So those are just illustrations of some of the ideas that you can use the Lego metaphor for, that really we can see in our data work in reality.
And I was smiling as I was reading the book because it reminded me, I've always found that even if you take something simple like IKEA furniture, so in theory, putting IKEA furniture together is easy. I've always found if you happen to be buying 3 of the same thing, 3 chests of drawers, the first one, I will probably screw up. By the second one, the third time I've done it, I know what I'm doing. And
Yep.
so it logically seems to me that the more we can get, to your point, get into that practice and therefore build a sort of standard set of mechanisms, we can start to roll that out. And so I love that. Both, I thought it was great for projects, but I just think for us individually, and it made me think of so many other parallels of, whether that is Barack Obama always wearing the same, very limited clothing range in terms of suits, because that just removes one more decision, right? You know that it works. It looks good on screen. You've dealt with that issue. So I really like this, that actually there's basic techniques that we can all adopt. And as we think about, yes, it works on these big level, but I think part of the reason I found it really compelling is I could reference that in my own life and say, here's the human experience I've been through. And we all know that if we, the 10,000 hours thing, then we can question whether that's accurate. But there was something nice about, you were pointing towards a very human trait that if we stop and think, actually we can see patterns where that works for us individually, and therefore there's no reason to assume that when we get together collectively that you couldn't adopt the same principles.
Totally true. And to take myself as an example, and I hadn't thought about this before, but after I wrote this up for the book, this is things I've been thinking about for many years, but I really systematized it in the book. And I realized that language is actually very modular. So I decided to try it on my writing. So treat my writing as Lego. So obviously, I mean, the alphabet is a bunch of Legos. We have 25 letters. They're each a Lego, and we can use each letter however many times we want, but we can make this incredible things, out of those 25 letters, we have the world literature. That's pretty mind-blowing if you think about it. But okay, bring it back to my own level of writing. So after I wrote this book, I've started to use it in a way where I think of the individual paragraph in what I'm writing as my Lego. And I actually don't think much about anything else but writing a good paragraph. And then I trust that I'll be able to string the paragraphs together later. I have some structure, like there's a theme for what I'm writing. But even when there's not, even if I just get an idea, out of the blue one day, hey, this could be interesting to write something about. I just write a paragraph about it. Then I have one Lego. And whenever I'm writing something where this concept or whatever it is relevant, I have this Lego and I bring it in. And then I put all the Legos on the page, or in the documents. And then I start putting them together like Lego bricks and build them into a text. So I found that it's much less stressful to write if all you have to be concerned about is just making one good paragraph and then another and then another. And then you trust that you can actually string them together into a meaningful text afterwards.
I love that. Wow. I'll be looking out for that in your future writings. And I do hope, by the way, that you write more books, because it's like both the content, but also the way that you've written it is extremely readable and engaging. And it was one of those, I never thought actually that a book around big mega projects would be sort of page turner that I couldn't put down, but you genuinely got me there.
Well, we've got to give some credit to my co-author here, Dan Gardner. I can write a readable text, but Dan can really, really spin a yarn. He's a journalist, and I have to give him credit, for the book being as readable as it is. And I think he did a great job. And even I enjoy reading, this. And he would break up my whatever, I would come with the text I would come with. He'd break it up and say, okay, we'll use one part up front in the book, and then we'll take this part, put it in the middle, and then we take this part and put it at the end, so that stories would actually pop up again in the book. I had the tendency to just tell the full story in one place, like keep it simple. But Dan is more sophisticated as a storyteller. So he would bring up the story and make it pop up in different parts of the overall narrative. And that works much better, So I'm glad that you like the read.
And the question I'm always fascinated by, when you've got such a rich vein of material out there, and of course, I'm very, very conscious of availability bias in the sense that once I'd read the book, everywhere I was looking for this, and it's not hard to find project overruns, things going wrong. I spent a lot of time in the UK, so I'm familiar with sort of mega projects not working on time. And partly, of course, when things are delivered on time, that's expected, right? So it doesn't make exciting news to say building delivered on time, but railway project that's overblown, that becomes exciting and interesting and newsworthy. But this is how did you go about choosing the stories? Because it seems to me there's just a wealth of content that you could have chosen. And clearly, you've got a database of them as well.
Have a huge database. At the time we wrote the book, 16,000 projects, and today we've already increased it to 20,000 projects. So this is a database that we are expanding all the time, and it's getting easier and easier. It was very difficult in the beginning to get data on this. They didn't exist, basically. There was no big sample study, where you had enough projects that you could actually do statistical analysis and so on. It was just like anecdotal stuff and maybe, samples of 10, 20 projects, which you can't do anything statistically reliable, certainly not regarding risk that you're interested in. You need bigger samples to get a realistic measure of risk. So some of the stories came from the database, but also, actually, you can't open the paper without there being good stories about big projects. So you open the New York Times or you open the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or whatever, you will have good stories. And it's actually, it's a bit unfair to pick on the UK, because the UK is either better or worse than other nations. Every nation we found, we have leaders, permanent secretaries and CEOs come to us and they say, hey, we have such terrible projects. We must be the worst in the world. People have this delusion that they are the worst in the world in this area. at each country, and we have 136 countries in our database, each one of them think that they're the worst. And then we can sort of chill, ask them to chill, take it easy. You're not the worst. You're just as bad as everybody else, And that's unfortunately the truth here. We can't find one nation where we could say, here's a country that has got this down. They actually have government and business who now know how to do projects. So now we all just need to do exactly like what this country is doing.
Right. You're almost looking for the Lego of countries, right? That you can just roll out whatever it is they do.
Exactly.
And I thought it was interesting because you mentioned China and obviously on the face of it, I mean, the amount of infrastructure projects going on there. And you deal with this nicely in the book where it's there's a presumption on the part of people, they must be good at this because they've done a ton of it. And can you just tell the story about how you got the data? I love this because on the face of it, it's like, well, how's he going to know what's going on there because of the nature of information? But you even managed to get data on China.
Yeah, this was a real piece of luck for us, because I've actually been invited to China to lecture and so on, and in one of the most prestigious universities there. And when I was there, I knew that everybody knows that no country in the world is doing more big projects than China, period. Not even close. And that it would be interesting to study how they do it. And there was, and still is, I think, this assumption that the Chinese are particularly good at this because they do it a lot and so on. They spend enormous amounts of money. That's basically how they keep the growth of their economy going, is by building all these projects. So I suggested to my colleagues there that we do joint research, let's start doing some data collection in China, then we compare it to my data and we'll see what it shows. And they say that's a great idea, Bent, but there is one problem. That is, if the party says there's no cost overrun, there's no cost overrun. And if we go out and do research that shows anything different from this, you won't be welcome as a visitor anymore. And we might have bigger problems than that, So I said, I understand. And let's put it off sometime in the future when things possibly change. Then in the meantime, I got a postdoc at Oxford who had worked for the World Bank before. And we talked about these things. And he said, wait, I actually think I can get some data via the back door in the World Bank because the World Bank is actually funding projects in China. And the World Bank will not fund anything they don't have data on. So he said there must be data in the World Bank. And he investigated and he found data for 97 big projects, road and rail projects in China. And we got into business, analyzing those. And we found, to the surprise of everybody, including ourselves, that China is not better at delivering on budgets than other countries. They're faster because they don't have the same legislation, regarding environmental issues and how you acquire land for projects and so on, and other kind of impacts of projects. They can just sort of ignore that. They don't have that in their society as yet. It's changing. They have more of that, but not nearly as much as you do in the UK or the US or Europe. So it was a bit surprising that we found that China is actually no better than the rest of the world regarding budget overruns. And we heard that study went to the highest places in China and they didn't like it, And I always, as a scholar, if I do something that somebody doesn't like, I know we're doing something right.
And so your point of it, because if I looked at, say Japan would be an example of, and you can see these videos on YouTube of sort of a bridge being built overnight, or they've had an earthquake and they repair it very quickly. So on the face of it, my heuristic tells me that they are better at this. But your research would appear to suggest that, yes, there will be things that they are quicker at. Presumably, logically, I guess if you're dealing with earthquake repairs, you've done it a number of times and therefore probably do have the sorts of Legos that you're talking about. But culturally, they're not necessarily in a stronger position from what you're saying.
Not overall, they're not. So these things about the quick bridge repair, I really think that is the way to go, where they actually do what we just talked about. They build everything offsite. Everything is designed in minute detail. They know exactly what they're doing. They're not faffing around on the construction side. They're faffing around on the computer, which is exactly the right place to faff around, because it's much cheaper to do it to faffing on the computer. And that's what they do. And then they figure out exactly what they're doing. They get everything built offsite. And then they have this extremely short assembly period, not construction period, but assembly period where they bring the pieces on site. That's the way to go. And that's actually being recognized around the world now. So the Japanese and the Chinese did pioneer this, but the US is doing, they just had a very successful project on a bridge that they did like this in the US that they are now using as a model and say, this is the way we got to do this. And it is based on the Lego principle.
Can't let you go without talking about Daniel Kahneman, who has said some nice things, understandably, about the book. But you've got a nice homage to him, which I'll let you repeat, which is playing off his famous book that listeners will be familiar with, Thinking Fast and Slow. Can you just talk us through that? Because I thought that was a beautiful encapsulation of your entire philosophy and goes to the things you were just talking about.
Yeah, so Thinking Fast and Slow is the title of Kahneman's best-selling book, where he sort of summarizes his life work in behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. And Kahneman has had a huge influence on my work, both just by reading his stuff, but he's also been kind enough of, meeting with me several times, giving me feedback, both person to person and in emails. And I wanted to have a nod to him, and his point in his book is thinking fast is what gets us into trouble. We need to think slow. Well, my field is about acting. We actually need to get things done. The book is called How Big Things Get Done, so it's not like, how do we think about big things? So I decided that given that Kahneman's work has such a big influence on my work, including what's in the book, the right heuristic here, and again, this is a leadership principle that I'm proposing, to any leader, is think slow, act fast. So listen to Kahneman regarding the thinking and think slow, and listen to me regarding the acting, act fast. And you can actually only act fast if you thought slow first, because if you think slow, you know what you're doing. The exact opposite happens in reality. People actually think fast, as Kahneman documents. This is our natural propensity. We have what's called availability bias, and that makes us run with anything that pops up in this unfortunate brain and fortunate brain that we're running around with. So an idea pops up, we can't resist it. We just go with it. That's availability bias, and that's thinking fast. And that really gets it in trouble when it's big projects, because if you haven't thought through what you are doing, it doesn't mean that the problems are not there. It means you have a lot of problems that have been buried, and they're going to manifest, they're going to hit you like a boomerang when you start building or doing. And that's exactly what we see in the majority of projects. They haven't been thought through well. And then they get all the problems during the implementation phase, during the acting, which means that it becomes very long. So we have some examples in there, where a project that was supposed to take 6 years takes 16 years, like the Sydney Opera House. And that's not uncommon, to see that you have a 10-year delay on a project that was supposed to take shorter than 10 years.
And the case study that you talk about in the book that I found really fascinating on that was where you're brought in halfway through. And you talk about Hong Kong, and I could see a situation where something's gone hideously wrong. It's been resolved. They go, that's never going to happen again. We better talk to Bent about to find out how we can stop this. Next time we do this, we'll get it right. And you talk about Hong Kong, where you were brought in halfway through, which I thought must be really exciting on the one hand, because you're literally in the engine room as things are happening. On the other hand, the project that you talk about was effectively the last chance saloon, right? This is a major infrastructure project where things have gone hideously wrong. And I just wanted to get your thought. I mean, what does that feel like to be put? Presumably it's really exciting to be in the depths of it, but there's an element of stress to that as well, I guess.
It feels great. That's all I can say. I love it. And this was directly into the boardroom, with the board of directors and the whole board present, because they had fired the CEO, they didn't have a CEO. They didn't have a project leader. They were without leadership. So the project had ended up in the boardroom, which is not where you want the project to be. I mean, it's okay to discuss the project in the boardroom, but if you start running the project from the boardroom, which is what we had to do for a period of time, that's a problem. But it's fantastic. And, there's nothing that people won't do for you when you're brought into the middle of the project. Any resources you need, anyone you need to talk to,
right?
Anything you want to get done, it happens. And so it's a fantastic position, but it is not the right time to bring me in or anybody else like that. You want to bring me in before you even start the project, because you want to do this up front, like we talked about, and think slow so you don't get into this position where you have to fix everything midstream. It's not a good place to be, like when you're wading across this turbulent river that it is to do a project. Then in the middle, you have to sort of change everything. You get rid of your leaders and you hire somebody from Oxford, in order to salvage your project. That's not a good idea. But we did salvage this particular project. It was the world's only 100% underground high-speed rail system with the world's largest underground high-speed rail station, dynamited 4 floors down into bedrock in the center of Hong Kong. There's no more difficult place to build something than in the center of a hiving city like Hong Kong. That's what they were doing. And the project went off the rails. It got flooded and all sorts of other problems. And delays, budgets started to blow up. And then, myself and my team were brought in, and we totally redid the whole thing. They were almost halfway through, and they spent more than half the budget. That's not a good combination. So we knew we had to go back to the legislature, LegCo as it's called in Hong Kong, and ask for more money. And I told the board, we have to get it right. It's a big humiliation. And in Hong Kong and Asia in general, they know about losing face and saving face. You don't want to lose face. They'd already lost face once, and I said, you don't want to lose face twice. That's actually unbearable. That would be unbearable. So we have to get this right. Now we have to work together to make sure we have a realistic budget. And we still had years, until we could hope to have budget completed. So we reprogrammed the whole thing. Instead of milestones, we invented something we called instones. Like now we needed to be so obsessive about what's going on that we can't do with milestones. We need instone, and we've got to follow every inch of this project, and make sure that every instone is met from now until 4 years later when the project could hopefully be completed. We did that. We estimated the new budget and went to LegCo and asked for the money for that, got the money, went back and continued the work. We estimated a new schedule, a new opening dates, and we announced a new opening date for the project where we built in some conservatism so that we also didn't want to have to go back and say, well, we set this date, but we can't meet it anyway. And actually, we met both. We met the budget that we set 4 years before completion, and we met the opening date that we also set 4 years before completion. So it was really successful from that point on. But you can say that the project overall was a success, because the first half was really messed up.
You talk a lot in the book about something that, and it's obvious when you point it out, but it's as ever with these things, once it's been pointed out to you, it's very clear. But the point you make in there is that we often, if we start something, we fall a little bit behind at the beginning. There's a sort of logic that says, well, we've got tons of time where we can catch up. And you make the point quite rightly that if you are behind schedule at the beginning, things aren't going to get better. There's a strong likelihood they'll actually get worse. And so this idea that because we have a lot of time left, we can, and I guess it's an interesting metaphor for life as well. It doesn't really matter. We can catch up later on. And as you rightly point out, that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's like, Warren Buffett talks about accumulated interest or compound interest, as it's also called. This is the same thing, the time that you waste up front is not going to do you any good. Actually, the opposite. It's going to compound later, and it gets more and more difficult to catch up with the longer that lasts. But basically, the bottom line is that the earlier you have a delay, the worse that delay is going to impact your project, because there's so much more remaining of the project to do. So there's so many more things that the delay can impact on. If you have the same delay, let's say a month's delay, like 3 months before you finish the project, that's not a big issue, because there's very few things that delay can impact on, because you already built like 98% of the project. But if you build 1% of the project, then there's 99% of the project left that the delay can impact on. And that's the logic. So again, this is one of these commonsensical things that people think they know, that is the exact opposite, that is the reality. And we need to identify all these things for big projects, because otherwise we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over, which is basically the history of mega projects to this date.
The other idea that I thought was really interesting, and I'd heard of it before, but you really made me think about it, was the idea of a reference class. And so as we look at this, our project is very unique. We don't have anything to compare away. You explain very clearly why, even if you think you haven't got anything comparable, there is data out there that one can use. And so can you just talk us through, probably actually helpful in a practical example of people's everyday lives, but the same thing applies to mega projects, obviously, about how can we go about picking a reference class? Because I thought that was That's a really interesting solution to the, I've got a very unique thing, and I can't possibly get any insights from anyone because they don't exist, because there isn't anything like this. You deal with that beautifully with the technique you propose.
Yeah, and that's actually a technique that initially was just sketched out by Kahneman and his co-author, Amos Tversky. It's just like an aside in one of their articles way back from, I think, 1979. So it's really old. And I just came across it. So I started to read everything that Kahneman had ever written. And I came across this. And then I thought, wow, this is an amazing idea. We can turn that into a methodology. And we have now. It's being used on thousands of projects around the world now. And the basic idea is that if you use the actual outcome of previous projects of the type that you're now planning to do, if you just use the average outcome, you will have a much better estimate of what's going to be the outcome of the project that you're doing. So let me illustrate with an example that is actually in the book. There's this famous author in New York called Robert Caro, who wrote a number of very famous books like The Power Broker and The Authority biography of Lyndon B. Johnson, the previous president of the United States, LBJ. And Robert Caro was originally a journalist, and he got this idea. He had covered Robert Moses, who was like a city official in New York, probably the individual in the world who has built the most mega projects of anybody personally, Robert Moses. And he was a city, city manager in New York in different roles. And he had covered him in journalism. So Robert Caro had been writing about Robert Moses in journalism. Now he realized there's a whole book about this. And he wanted to write that book. And then he sat down, how much of a leave of absence do I need, and how long will it take? And he figured, writing a chapter for a book is like writing, one of his bigger assignments, like a big feature or maybe a couple of features for the newspaper he was working at. And that would typically take him 3 weeks. So he figured, okay, how hard can it be? If I say if we say like there's going to be 15 chapters in the books, it's 15 times 3 weeks, and that's like, it's less than a year. So to be conservative, let me say a full year. So I need to have money that I can support myself for a full year. And Robert Caro actually quit his job, and with the consent of his wife, they had just had a newborn son and so on. So their financial situation was a bit precarious. And it turned out, he didn't get the book completed within the 1 year. It actually took him 7 years to complete the book. They had to sell their home and finance the book by the home, and they were really on the verge of personal financial ruin. And only later, when Robert Caro got a desk at the public library in New York City, in Manhattan, he got to talk to other authors, and he was almost embarrassed about saying he had taken 7 years. At that time, he had actually had only 5 years in. So he said, they asked him, what are you writing? He explained, I'm writing this book. So how long has it taken you? Well, 5 years. And then they would say, that's not so bad. My book on Benjamin Franklin took 9 years. And Robert Caro couldn't believe it, that he heard these other authors. All of a sudden, he felt like he was among peers instead of him being a freak who didn't know how to get a book finished within a year. To cut a long story short, what Robert Caro could have done was simply, find 10, 15 books, that he thought was similar to the books that he was planning to write. He would just write the authors of each of these books and ask them, how long did it take you to write this book? And he would take the average of that. So some authors would say 2 years, some authors would say 15 years, and most would be somewhere between those two extremes. And he would actually get 7, 8 years as an average for that kind of book, like a big, fat, well-documented book. And he would have had a more realistic estimate, much, much, much more. He would actually have landed at an estimate around the actual time it took. Instead, he was thinking about his book as unique. Can you see this again? His uniqueness bias. He didn't think about other books out there and bring in the data from those, the experience from those, in order to estimate how long it would take him to write his book. And that was the error. If he had done this simple thing, and this is something that could be done, with less than a day's of work, you could do this. And then he would have had a realistic estimate of how long it would take. So that's the idea behind reference class forecasting. The reference class in this instance would have been the books that and authors that Robert Caro would have contacted and asked them, how long did it take you to write your book? And the reference stars forecast would be the average of how long these authors took. We have generalized this to a method that we can use on any kind of project, big and small, and it's being used on multi-million dollar projects now, or billion-dollar projects around the world. And independent studies have come out that have estimated the accuracy of the method, and it turns out that this method is more accurate than any other forecasting method that is out there right now.
And the bit I love about it is you don't then have to think about specific details too much, because what you're doing is getting the aggregate of human experience. And so all of these things that you talk about, all of the biases, all of the things that might happen, that will give you a range that if you've got a big enough sample set, and you even make the point that even just one is better than none, it's beautiful because it stops you having to worry because your ability to estimate things and to think about the Rumsfeld, unknown unknowns and all those sorts of things, it's already baked in to the past. Yep. And so your point there is you're literally benefiting from the sum total of all of both the physical and logistical and sort of external constraints, but also you're factoring in those internal human errors that will also kick in the forecasting. And so I love that because it points in a world where we're sort of, it's lots and lots of data and people like to overanalyze and get very specific. And we've got the ability to do that. But actually, this is a really simple heuristic that says we don't know half of this stuff, right? The past isn't necessarily reflective of where you're at now. So let's take a totality of experiences and use that as a proxy, because that will include a lot of the things that might go wrong.
Exactly. And again, this is an example of what I said earlier. With these very complex projects, you need to keep it simple. If you try to model all that complexity you talked about there, the unknowns and so on, you just end up in a hairball. It does not work, and we have lots of examples of that.
Amazing. Ben, I could keep talking forever. It's absolutely fascinating. Remind people what the book is called and where they can get hold of you.
The book is called How Big Things Get Done, and the subtitle is The Surprising Factors That Determine the Fate of Every Project, from home renovations to space exploration and everything in between. And we had a bit of discussion about that long subtitle. The publishers don't like long subtitles, but we got it anyway, and I'm pleased with that. But I do think that there's one thing that we should talk about in addition to where you can get the book. So you can get the book in any bookstore, that's the answer to that. But given that this is a risk program, we should talk about fat tails. Fat tails is something that we talk about in the book. And this is a new finding that not a lot of people know about yet. It's something that we had just started as we started writing the book. And I've included some of our results, our preliminary results. Now we are coming out with more results about fat tails. And it turns out that the majority of big projects are fat tails. There are a few that are not fat tails. And interesting, that brings us back to the Legos, because the projects that don't have fat tails are the projects you can deliver as Legos. Now, isn't that interesting? That means that the Lego is actually your most efficient risk reduction device that you can find. And I think that's an important finding, but it's also important to keep in mind that the majority of big projects have fat tails. So this means that the risks that you're facing are completely different from the risks that we usually deal with. So there are no normal distributions. You don't have Gaussian or normal distributions, as they're called. And most risk analysis and most risk management is assuming some kind of near normal or normal distribution. And that means that the risk assessment methods and the risk management methods are totally underestimating the real risk. And this is what we see over and over again, that the projects are blowing up in the face of the risk managers and the other managers because they have completely underestimated the risk. It's because the risk is fat-tailed. There are lots of black swans in the long tail of these projects, to use Nassim Nicholas Taled's famous metaphor for extreme risk. Extreme risk is a black swan. And unfortunately, the majority of big projects are black swans. And the fact that people overlook this brings us back to what we started with, which was your biggest risk is you. So you can see that overlooking the black swan is an excellent example of you being your biggest risk. If the black swans are in there and you overlook them and don't take them into account, you can be sure one thing: you have an extremely high likelihood of blowing up. That's exactly what you don't want to. And that's exactly what risk management is supposed to be about protecting you from blowing up.
Beautiful. I was going to close out by asking you what you're up to next, but as you rightly point out, that I thought it was lovely that you included some research at the back, and there's a very clear journey that you're on, and we can see that we can sort of point in the direction of futures. So I want to say, firstly, thank you for the work that you've done, for writing a great book. I found it absolutely fascinating. Also, a big fan of what you do on social media, so I'll put links to your accounts, the book, and all of those sort of things in there, so people can follow you and track that. But keep doing what you're doing, because I think it's nice to have someone doing that's clearly societally beneficial. None of us benefits when we get projects that massively overrun, particularly if we're the taxpayer funding them. And I think it's much more fun when things work in the world as opposed to when they don't, although we can clearly learn from those things. So with all of those things, and particularly thanks for being a great guest on the podcast, it's been an absolute pleasure, Bent.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that really pleases me is that more and more people in high places, so the real decision makers, are beginning to see what we're talking about here. So just last week, I actually had a full hour with the Secretary of Transportation in the U.S., Pete Buttigieg. You know, we discussed these things just like you and I have done now, and he's interested in how can he use this as the Secretary of Transportation in the U.S., where they now have to deliver $1.2 trillion worth of infrastructure, and they want to, use intelligent principles so that they spend the money well. That's really encouraging to see that the ideas are getting that kind of leverage now.
Love it. Fantastic. What a fabulous, in a world where there's lots of things to be miserable about, very uplifting message. So thank you for that. And thank you once again for being a wonderful guest on the show.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Bent for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Bent, his book, How Big Things Get Done, his consulting work and research, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find episodes of the show that you might have missed, we're currently almost at 250 episodes of the show. You can visit the show website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, remember that if you're planning a mega project or participating in one at work or in your private life, the biggest risk facing that project is human. Stay safe, and thanks so much for listening.